Hi, boys and girls. Today I'm going to read you a story that is a tall tale about a character named Paul Bunyan. A tall tale is a fictional or made up story that has a character that's larger than life or does things that ordinary humans cannot do. A tall tale also has a lot of exaggerations. Now, an exaggeration is where the truth is being stretched or embellished to make it a little more interesting. An example of an exaggeration you might have heard in real life would be someone say they're so hungry they could eat a horse. Now, they're really hungry and they want a meal, but they cannot really eat an entire horse. This is an example of an exaggeration. Now, our story about Paul Bunyan, which is a core knowledge story, has lots of exaggerations. So I want you to listen carefully to this story. As I read, I'm going to ask you some different questions to see if you can think about if this is an exaggeration or if it's not. You might also want to have a United States map available to kind of look at during this story, because I'm going to be talking about different places in the United States that maybe Paul visited when he was a child or an adult. I hope you really enjoy the story of Paul Bunyan. Even as a baby, Paul Bunyan was mighty big. How big? Well, he was so big that his parents had to use a covered wagon for his cradle. Now, did Paul really sleep in a covered wagon as a baby? Or is that an exaggeration? As you might imagine, young Paul Bunyan had a big appetite. He gobbled up 5 barrels of porridge a day, and his parents had to milk 4 dozen cows every morning and evening just to keep his baby bottle filled. Now, do you think he really ate 5 barrels of porridge a day? Or that his parents milked 4 dozen cows to fill his baby bottle? Are those more examples of exaggerations? Paul was so big it caused some problems in the little town in Maine where he grew up. When he sneezed, he blew the birds from Maine to California. When he snored, the neighbors ran out of their houses hollering, "Earthquake! Earthquake!" After that, Paul's father thought it might be better if Paul didn't sleep in town. He built a cot on a large raft for Paul and floated it off the coast. Paul slept on the raft for a few nights, but the floating cot didn't work out. When Paul turned over in his sleep, he created gigantic waves that knocked down houses along the coast. Now, would parents really put their baby on a floating raft to sleep in the harbor? Is this another exaggeration? I think so. Eventually, Paul's father decided that the East Coast was just too small for Paul Bunyan. The only sensible thing to do was to move out west. So the Bunyan family moved to Minnesota. If Paul was too big for the East Coast, why do you think his father thought it would be better out west? Do you know why people were moving out west during this time? In those days, Minnesota was full of logging camps, sawmills, and lumberjacks. Now, a lumberjack is someone who cuts down trees. A sawmill is where the trees are turned into boards. And people use the wood from the trees to build houses and to make many other things. Americans were moving west and building the country. They had to cut down a lot of trees to make their homes, not to mention their schools, churches, boats, and furniture. When he grew up, Paul Bunyan went to work as a lumberjack, and what a lumberjack he proved to be. He made himself a giant axe with a handle carved out of a full-grown hickory tree. He could bring down a giant tree with a single swing of an axe. Now, could a man really make an axe with the top of a tree? Or chop down a giant tree with one swing of his axe? Are these exaggerations? As the tree tipped over, he would yell, "Timber!" So the other lumberjacks had time to get out of the way. Everyone looked up to Paul Bunyan, way up. The other lumberjacks were full of admiration for him. Now, admiration means that they thought very highly of him. The bosses were grateful for the amazing amount of work he would do in a single day. Paul had a big heart too, but one thing he always wished for was a true friend. There simply wasn't anyone else his size who could be his friend. That all changed during the winter of the big blue snow. It was called the winter of the big blue snow because it was so cold that everyone shivered and turned blue. Even the snow shivered and turned blue. Now, do you think the snow could really turn blue? Or is that an exaggeration? One day, as Paul made his way through the blue snowdrifts, he heard a muffled whisper. Now, if the muffled whimper, if the whimper was muffled, could he hear it really well? He followed the noise until he saw two big blue furry things sticking out of the snow. He reached down and gave a pull. What do you think is going to be in the snow? It turned out that the two big blue furry things were two big blue ears. And connected to the big blue ears were a giant blue baby ox. Paul exclaimed, "The poor little fellow is half frozen." Paul carried the blue ox home, wrapped him in blankets, and fed him. The baby ox was so content that he took a long nap in Paul's big, strong arms. When he woke, he looked up at Paul, and do you know what he said? "Mama! Mama!" Then he gave Paul a big, slobbery lick on the face. Paul laughed and said, "Babe, we're going to be great friends." And they were. In fact, Paul Bunyan and Babe the blue ox were soon inseparable. That means they could not be separated. Everywhere Paul went, Babe went too. The two of them worked together in the lumber camps. Paul chopped down the trees. Then Babe hauled them to the river and chopped them so that they could float downstream to a sawmill. Now remember, in order for the settlers to farm new land, they sometimes had to prepare it for growing new crops and building homes. They often do this by clearing the land, all the trees away from the land. Together, Babe and Paul did the work of 100 men. Now, do you think they could really do the work of 100 men? Or is this another exaggeration? The lumber company figured the best way to keep Paul Bunyan happy was through his stomach. So they hired a special cook to feed Paul and Babe. Now, I want you to think, why would the lumber company want to keep Paul Bunyan happy? The cook's name was Sourdough Sam. Now, sourdough is a kind of bread. Sourdough Sam was known for the giant flapjacks he cooked in the world's largest frying pan. Now, flapjacks are another name for a pancake. The colossal pan sat on the enormous cast iron frame. Colossal means it was unbelievably large. Every morning, Sourdough Sam would build a raging forest fire underneath the pan. Then he would call for his two helpers, Lars Larson and Pete Peterson. Lars and Pete would grease up the pan by tying slabs of bacon to their feet and skating back and forth across the sizzling pan. Now, greasing a giant griddle with bacon on their feet and cooking over a forest fire sounds more like an exaggeration to me. Then Sourdough Sam would make a giant stack of pancakes for Paul and an even larger stack for Babe. Thanks to Sourdough Sam and his overgrown flapjacks, Babe eventually grew to be even bigger than Paul. He was so big that if you were standing at his front legs, you would have to use a telescope to see all the way to his back legs. In fact, he was so heavy that his footprints filled up with water and turned into lakes. Now, Babe making lakes with his footprints sounds like an example of an exaggeration to me. In fact, there were more than 10,000 lakes in Minnesota today, and most of those were created by Babe the Blue Ox back in the frontier days. Babe and Paul helped the lumberjacks solve all sorts of problems. Once there was a river that was full of twists and turns. Sometimes the trees would get stuck in the turns and never make it downstream to the sawmill. But Paul Bunyan thought of a way to fix that. He went to one end of the river and sent Babe to the other end. Paul grabbed the river and pulled in one direction. Babe pulled the other end in the opposite direction. Then snap! Just like that, all of the kinks were pulled out, and the river was as straight as an axe handle. Paul and Babe straightening a river is another example of an exaggeration. Of course, this tightening operation left the river a good deal longer than it had been before, and there was a lot of extra water lying around. Paul and Babe worked together to dig 5 big holes to hold all of the extra water. Nowadays, these are called the Great Lakes. Did Paul Bunyan actually create the Great Lakes? This is definitely another exaggeration. One day, the logging bosses got to talking. One of them said that the United States was a fine country, to be sure, but it could stand a little improvement. For one thing, it could use a few more rivers. And what it really needed was a big river running right down the middle of the country, all the way from Minnesota down to New Orleans. If we had a river like that, the man said, we could ship timber down to New Orleans and all around the world. What river do you think they're talking about? Paul Bunyan happened to overhear this conversation. He told the bosses he would see what he could do. He hitched up Babe, and they started plowing south. As they plowed, they threw a great mound of dirt and rocks to the right and a smaller mound to the left. On the right side, they made the Rocky Mountains, and on the left side, they made the Appalachian Mountains. You can find both of these on a map of the United States. Paul Bunyan and Babe didn't stop until they had plowed a channel all the way south to the Gulf of Mexico. And the river that flows in that channel nowadays, that's what we call the Mississippi River. Now, the Mississippi River was a very important means of transportation in frontier days and still is today. From that day on, Paul and Babe went around the country, using their size and strength to help anyone who needed it. Later, they dug the Grand Canyon as they made their way to the west coast of California. Now, did Paul really make the Grand Canyon? This is another exaggeration. And when the wind blows just right from the west, you can still smell those infamous colossal pancakes cooking on the frontier. Now, do you think you can really smell those pancakes, or is that another exaggeration? I hope you enjoyed that story. The end. Think of all the exaggerations you heard about how big Paul Bunyan was, how big Babe the Blue Ox were. Think about what makes Paul Bunyan a legendary character. What makes him special? How is he larger than life? I want you to think about all the things in nature that they credited to Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox for making. I hope you enjoyed the story. Bye.